So why don't we go ahead and get started? We are recording today, so everyone knows. I'm so happy to welcome everyone who's coming to this training and who'll be watching it later on as the recording. My name is Lisa Patterson. I'm the Vice Dean for Career Services at the University at Buffalo School of Law. I have been working with ILS and CDANY and the Chief Defenders, as well as the Legal Aid Bureau of Buffalo on this initiative for the last 4 years. This is our 4th year of the annual Public Defenders Career Fair, and we're super happy to welcome everybody. So please, thank you for coming. I'm so excited this year, in addition to doing our normal Zoom training, to welcome a guest to talk to us about recruiting with an eye towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her name is Luchelli Chizunka, and I'm going to turn this over to her for the first part of the presentation to tell you a little bit about herself and to get us started on a wonderful discussion about this. And after about 45 minutes, we'll pick up with the second half, which will be the nuts and bolts of how to use Zoom in your room. So with that said, Luchelli, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that introduction, and thank you so much to everyone for participating today, either here right now or who are going to be watching on video later. As Lisa said, my name is Luchelli Chizunka, and I am currently the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Liaison here at ILS. My background is I have a master's degree in public policy. And prior to joining ILS, I was a community organizer in Syracuse, New York at the Center for Community Alternatives, working on juvenile criminal justice. So I was part of the Raise the Age New York campaign, advocating to raise the age of criminal responsibility, and kind of working in Central and Western New York to get support from the ground, in addition to the support in New York City, and then also working in Onondaga County to end solitary confinement of youth. Today, I'm going to be focusing on providing you with some tools and some guidance on how to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion in the hiring process, and how to hopefully avoid implicit bias. So before I get into it, I know we don't have a lot of people on the call, but I'm going to kind of put you on the spot into how to incorporate DEI into the hiring process. I wanted to know if everyone is kind of familiar with what implicit bias is, or if anyone wanted to take a stab at saying what unconscious bias is. I can't see you, so I can't tell if you are able to unmute or not.
I'm giving our guests a chance, but I will jump in to let you off the hook. Luchelli, I'll take a stab at it and say that when I think of unconscious bias, I think of preconceived notions that someone might have about a particular group that affect the way that they treat a person from that group.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah. So unconscious bias is when we have attitudes towards people or associate stereotypes with them without our conscious knowledge. And kind of when I was first learning about this, I was a bit taken aback. I think I consider myself to be a relatively self-aware person, and I try to do what I can to treat everyone equally and believe that, I have morals and values that are kind of in line with, what DEI is. And it gave me pause to think about the fact that I might have bias. It made me uncomfortable. And then I started to do some research and realized that, unconscious bias is something that each and every single one of us has, regardless of your race, regardless of your gender, your education level, it doesn't matter. It's simply a result of how our brains process information. And so I do try to start off to say that one of the things I hope that everyone remembers is that working in public defense does not make you exempt from having unconscious bias. Every single person has it. And I hope that you kind of keep that in mind as you start to incorporate DEI into your hiring practices and as you incorporate it into the work that you do, that you may be uncomfortable, but you have to challenge yourself and sometimes even your colleagues to confront the bias that exists. But that means that you're doing the work, and hopefully that kind of motivates you through to be able to push forward. So with that in mind, how exactly does it work? So our brains process 11 million bits of information per second. Our unconscious brains process 11 million bits of information per second. And our conscious brains process about 40 bits of information per second. So when you think about that, that's kind of crazy. Our unconscious brain's ability to process all of that information is usually a good thing. It means that we don't actually have to actively think that your gloves go on your hands, or that shoes go on your feet, or that you're supposed to pour coffee into a cup, right? It allows you to get through some of the more mundane parts of your day without having to put too much thought into it, which is great. But when it comes to social interactions, hiring practices, being in a professional environment, that's when the unconscious parts of our brain can actually start to work against us. How do you view a candidate who is tall versus a candidate who is short? It's possible that you unconsciously think that someone who is tall has more gravitas than someone who is short, and that is something that exists. That's height bias. It's possible that you might think that a candidate who went to a certain school is more qualified than someone who went to a school that you're less familiar with. That can be confirmation bias. Or you might think that someone that has a different background or interest from you might not be as compelling or interesting as someone that has similar interests to you, and that's affinity bias. There's so many different types of bias that come into play as you go into the hiring process. So how do you avoid that? There are several tools that you can use to incorporate into your hiring process that can hopefully help to mitigate bias. The first rule that I would kind of have you keep in mind is be clear about the role that you are hiring for. At this point, because this is a career fair, you most likely already have the role in mind that you're going to be hiring for. But for the future, and you can actually still go back and look at the job description and kind of do a bias check, be sure to only list duties that are truly required for a candidate to perform successfully. So for example, if you're looking for someone for a supervisor position, you may want them to be organized, to have the ability to build relationships and work with diverse groups of people. Your preference might be to hire someone who is extroverted, but that's not actually an essential function of successfully executing the duties of the role, right? So make sure that you're very, very focused in on the specifics and the requirements of what the job actually are, and focus on that as opposed to your preferences when you're creating a job description. Another thing to keep in mind is to make sure that your job description doesn't inadvertently play into unconscious bias. So what does that mean? Poorly chosen written words can also have an impact on who might apply for a position. So I would advise that you use gender-neutral terms. Say if you want to write that you're looking for someone who is a chairperson, say chairperson as opposed to chairman. Men are likely to apply for jobs that for which they only meet 60% of the listed requirements. Whenever possible, soften the message of desired requirements by using language such as this person should have familiarity with, they can get bonus points for, or if you have a combination of these skills. The goal is not to lower standards, but to eliminate unnecessary barriers, provide for experiential alternatives, and create more equitable and inclusive recruiting practices. Any questions so far?
Lucelli, when you say that men tend to apply for things for which they're only 60% qualified or meet the requirements, is the flip side of it that females tend to be more strict with themselves about what they apply for?
Yes. So oftentimes women will look at a job description, and if they don't meet every single requirement, they could be missing one of the requirements, they will not hit that apply button because they think that, well, I don't know how to do that, so that means that I'm not qualified for the job. And of course, we know that that's not true. You know, you come in with all different types of experiences, and you never know how a qualification that you have that might not be listed could make you an excellent candidate for the position.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Next is posting the job and reviewing resumes. So to increase diversity, you should really try to be intentional and inclusive about where you market your job. So create a list of several places to post job announcements to help to build a diverse and quality pool. So I know that there are some providers in the past who have done some targeted recruitment. They have worked with, I know Lisa, you mentioned this to me as well, worked with law schools and partnered with minority serving institutions and organizations and worked with them to develop recruitment plans to say that anytime that we are hiring, we are going to come to you and work with you to you know, see which students, you know, might be interested in this job posting. And, you know, sometimes you have to be a little bit more active. You can't just post on your county's website. Not everyone will go on your county's website. You know, sometimes it's better to reach out and find candidates via social media. I know that on LinkedIn, there are often, you know, people when they get out of law school or graduate school, sometimes they'll put right next to their name that they are someone who is searching for a job. You can have someone in your office or work with them who's dedicated to kind of doing some targeted recruitment on social media. Another suggestion is to try and recruit continuously, not just when there are openings. If you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion liaison or officer or director in your office, you can work with them to kind of go and talk about DEI and the law and DEI and public defense and kind of familiarize students and candidates at career fairs or just visiting, you know, an academic institution to kind of say, this is what's happening, this is what's out there, these jobs are out there, and we're very interested in having you and having you come on board. And so you kind of have to be more active in your engagement and reaching out to say that these jobs are here and we want you.
Luchelli, can I ask a question that people may be afraid to ask you?
Mm-hmm.
That is that some of our participants, I imagine, are coming from more rural counties or counties that don't have a lot of intrinsic diversity in their population, and also from very small offices, right, where they may not have all of these roles available. Do you have any advice for people who may be trying to make an outreach effort with the Minority Bar Association or some other organization, the best way that they can go about describing, you know, their job or attracting people to their job when the setting itself isn't already very diverse at all?
Yeah, so I actually was just having a conversation with someone about this before we started, and don't count yourself out just because you are a provider that's in a rural area or that, you know, you're a provider with a very small office. Even if you think that you are kind of in a diversity desert where, you know, if someone comes, they're going to be surrounded by absolutely nothing, that might not necessarily be true. So my first, after just don't count yourself out, I would say kind of, if you haven't already, take a look around, not only in your city or your county, but even neighboring counties, and try and, you know, see if there are bar associations, and even look at non-legal community groups or events that exist in your area, and know that that could kind of be a point of connection for someone who may be interested in the job but is unsure about the area, right? Because I feel that oftentimes people will think like, oh my gosh, there's nothing there. But then you realize like, well, there's actually this whole community. They might not be mainstream, you know, you might not see them, you know, in typical areas, but they exist. So I would ask you kind of is going along with kind of doing targeted recruitment, is actually like kind of taking a look around your county and your city and your community and say, am I kind of missing out on, you know, groups of people who are here who might be able to engage with the candidate? And also when I say don't count yourself out, is your area has something to offer. And just because you're not downstate doesn't mean that it's not a place that might be of interest to a diverse candidate. I remember when I started working at ILS, one of the first trips we took was we went to the North Country. I went to Malone in Franklin County, and I went to Canton in St. Lawrence County. And I remember when I got out of the car, and I'm born and raised in Syracuse, New York. I grew up in New York State, but I'd never been to the North Country. And I remember getting out of the car and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, the air is so fresh and clean out here. Like, this is amazing. It's beautiful. You know, I thought that that was like amazing. That was appealing to me. And I think that just because a candidate might not look like the typical person who might be, you know, where that might be attractive to them, kind of don't cut yourself off by assuming that just because the person is different from you or has a different background from you, that they might not be interested, you know, that, you know, the North Country might not be appealing to them. You never know. So kind of remember that as much as someone is coming in to be interviewed, right, and they're presenting their best self, you also have to present your best self and kind of say like, okay, yes, we might be in a rural area, but, you know, we have hiking and biking and all of these different things. And, you know, we have this community that does events. It might be small, but they're mighty. And, you know, this might be a place where you're able to engage. So I would say just kind of try to stay open yeah, don't count yourself out just because you're in an area that's a little bit more difficult. And in terms of kind of connecting with, like if you want to connect with more minority bar associations and things like that, you can always contact ILS to work with you. If you don't already have a DEI director on staff or, you know, access to one, you can always connect with ILS and say like, we really want to do this. As you may know, we don't have that many resources to do that right now, and we can help you through that process. The attorney who's assigned to you can help you. I'm the DEI liaison. You can always reach out to me, and I can set aside some time to be able to work with you to see if there's some organizations or institutions where you can kind of do some, find some connection.
Thank you. That's so helpful.
All right. So next is the interview process. And I would say do as much as you can to inform candidates about the interview and what the process will look like beforehand. So many of you are probably already doing this, but let them know if they have to submit anything in writing to you, how many people will be in the room. It can be daunting for some people to think that they might be talking to 1 or 2 people and then they walk into a room and there are 5 or 6 people in the room. Let them know who's in the room. Let them know if there will be multiple interviews. This is more for kind of like a post-COVID world, but if you have someone in your office who greets the candidate, or since we're doing things virtually, who communicates with the candidate before the interview, they should not share their first impression with you before the interview happens, because of course that person is going to have their own bias and that can influence and create bias in you about the candidate. So it should be very, very sterile beforehand. You know, you just stick to this is what's happening, this is where you need to be, this is what's going to happen, that's it. However, once the interview is complete, the person who greeted the candidate or communicated with the candidate beforehand can share the impressions, particularly if they are administrative or support staff, right? So they could let you know if the person was respectful or demanding or dismissive, because, you know, that kind of speaks into like, are they going to be able to work in this office as a professional? But it's very important to brief not only the people who will be conducting the interview, but also anyone else who's going to come into contact with the candidate, that their impressions should not be shared beforehand. And the reason why they shouldn't is because of unconscious bias. So you can kind of share that information. It's a way to kind of let your staff in on DEI as you start to work more on this issue. So one of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing this is these interviews are happening virtually, and a lot of people are still working in various places. Some people are partially remote, some people are fully back to work. And for people who are still working from home, there could be a whole production going on in the background while they are in the middle of their interview. And it's important to be mindful that people are still working from home. They may have extended family, they may have children, they may have pets to deal with during the interview. And try to make it clear up front that you understand that these are unique circumstances. Obviously, we're still in the middle of a global pandemic, and try not to judge a candidate based on the abode that you see behind them going on. Not everyone knows that they can't put up a beautiful background like Lisa has. So try to just focus on the words that they are saying in response to the questions that you will ask them. And then I don't know if you've gone over this already, or Lisa will give this as a tip. Sorry if I'm stepping on your toes, but I would also recommend offering an alternative phone number for candidates to call if you have connection issues. I know that we were conducting some interviews at the beginning of the summer, and one of our candidates got cut off, they could not connect, and then we realized, oh shoot, we didn't give them actually a number to be able to finish the interview. So trying to kind of get that type of housekeeping out of the way beforehand. And of course, you know, those types of things shouldn't have a bearing on whether or not that person can perform the duties of the job. So with that out of the way, back to what happens when you're going through the interview process. So this should be very, very structured. Interview questions should be predetermined and linked directly to the duties of the job. So I like to think of it as kind of like if you're doing a research project and you're trying to come up with, like, you have to ask questions of every single candidate in exactly the same way to all of them. That's the way that you can make it the most equitable. Focus on requirements and not preferences or traditions. You can ask experience-based questions as long as they are predetermined, and focus solely on job content. So for example, if you want to ask a candidate a question about, say, if you're in the middle of negotiations and X, Y, or Z happens, what did you do? That's fine. This type of question can help to assess a candidate's ability to solve a problem, but just make sure that if you're asking that of one candidate, you're asking that of everyone. If possible, and I know that some of the smaller counties will not be able to do this, but there should be a diverse interview panel that consists of multiple interviewers to allow for different perspectives, because that helps to reduce the impact of bias in the hiring process. As you kind of go through afterwards and do your assessment, you might, you know, want to eliminate someone, and your colleague might say, why is that? What made you think that? When I was looking, and that can kind of reveal if you have a bias that kind of made you think like, oh, well, that candidate's not worth it. And you might realize like, oh, actually I'm eliminating them because of a bias that I have. So try to make sure that you have a diverse panel. And then lastly, kind of during the interview, think of yourself as a stenographer. Take notes on what the candidate says, not your interpretation of their responses. You want to make sure that you're only recording what they're saying. After the interview, I would say that if you have an interview panel, discuss the candidate's responses. And this is kind of where you can kind of check for bias, as I was mentioning earlier, to say, did I interpret this question a certain way because of a bias that I have? I would recommend, I'm not sure kind of the format for the virtual career fair, but if it's possible to do an assessment immediately after the interview while the information is fresh, and leaving time to assess each candidate and check bias. And then also to kind of go back to the job description and kind of put it up against the candidate's responses to see what you deemed most important from the beginning. You should be judging the candidates against the job duties and not each other. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So Michele, the format of the fair will vary based on how busy the various offices are. There may be some floating in and out of students and grads who are going to just sort of have conversations as though they were at a table, or like walking around in a room of displays. So it may not be quite as structured, but then I know some offices are also setting up breakout rooms where they will have a more official interview process, in which case they can, implement these questions that you're talking about. So do you have any tips, I guess, for the more casual, maybe networking / informational conversations that may be happening throughout the day? Say a candidate comes in and they're not necessarily interviewing, but they're asking questions about the office and trying to evaluate. Any thoughts about the best way to approach those conversations?
Yeah, I would say to, if it's possible, kind of come up with a little list for yourself beforehand, right? So that you are kind of presenting the same information to all of the candidates who have questions. Now, of course, they might have questions. One person, they're not all going to ask the same questions, but you kind of have an idea before a career fair, the type of questions that you're going to get. And also, if you're going to have them come back for an interview, make sure you're giving that same information to everyone. And for kind of like the more informal conversations, I think that that's kind of where the focus is more on like just selling your office more, being able to say like, we have this job and we want you to come. I think that if you have any, if you're already in an office where they're doing DEI, you're considering DEI. If you're in an office where you have mentoring and second chair programs, talk about that, because I think that, I think a lot of times people think diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're just kind of thinking of like bringing on people from underrepresented groups. But what is also very appealing, I think, is also being able to have that component of professional development. And kind of like show that you have this that you have to offer from your office. So even if you're kind of in a less formal setting, you should still kind of have in mind kind of a list that you're kind of working off of, so that you can try and present as much information in the same way to as many people as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, as you're going through your post-interview check, there are some questions that you can ask yourselves. Why do I see an applicant this way? This is kind of part of like bias check that you can do. Why do I see an applicant this way? I know that I spoke to someone earlier who said that I realized that if someone went to a certain school, that I was kind of internally thinking that they were not a good candidate, and it didn't actually have anything to do with the responses that they gave. I just kind of saw that they went to a certain school and was kind of rating them lower than the other candidates. So kind of consider places where you might have a certain bias. Make sure that your conclusions are evidence-based, so based on the responses that the candidate gave, and make sure that you have enough information to make sure that the conclusion that you arrive at is not informed by bias, and that you're considering all perspectives. And also try to look for ways to say yes. And I think I spoke about this earlier, like I think of it like cutting yourself off. Like, I might not be able to engage with this person because they are from a different background or gender, or race, or sexuality than me. And I don't find that to be the case. You kind of have to find a way to be open, and that's the way that you'll be able to bring on a diverse group of people into your office. And that kind of ties into my next one, which is don't overlook or undervalue the unfamiliar or unexpected. You never know who is interested and who might be a perfect fit for your office. And don't undervalue or underestimate that just because they don't have a specific connection to you, that they wouldn't be a valuable addition. And more experience doesn't always mean the most experienced. I think that sometimes, I think this is something that's pretty well known, but sometimes people from underrepresented groups might not have had the same networking opportunities. They might not have had the same access to internships or clerkships or things like that. So you might look at their resume and think, oh, it's a little bit thin, but more experience does not always mean the most experience. And so I would say, you know, take in the whole of their professional backgrounds and kind of be open, be open. And always try to keep in mind the ways that institutional bias may influence how you define merit and excellence. So consider culture additions, which are the various forms of diversity that can add value to your team and department. And, you know, I say with all of that, as you start to kind of incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion, you can connect with ILS, connect with your attorney that's working with you, with Matt. You can always email me. There is money for this in the budget. I know many of you are going through the budget process right now, and don't hesitate to say, I would like to have a diversity, equity, and inclusion director or officer in my office. Is there someone who's going to be coming up in the region? What can we do to do more work around this? You know, is there funding for trainings? You know, things like that. Yes, there is. And so you can contact ILS directly to have those discussions with us, and, you know, try to make sure that you're on board with all of this. I know it's a lot to take in. It can be very overwhelming, particularly in this format. So sometimes it's easier to kind of have that one-on-one conversation. Don't hesitate to call and say, I want to set up a meeting to discuss this. But, you know, doing this is a long process. It's not an easy process. It requires you to look inward and kind of do some self-assessment while you're also trying to deal with all of the other things that you have to deal with on a daily basis. So I would just say, try to stay open, and know that you are not alone. I didn't talk too much about, you know, when you know, if you do bring someone on board who's from an underrepresented group, you know, kind of what that means. Like, say you go through the interview process, you're successful, you bring on a candidate who was like amazing, and they're from an underrepresented group. You have to make it clear that you support them, because the other piece of this, of course, is you're doing recruitment. You want to be sure that you're able to retain that employee. And one of the first things that will make an employee leave is isolation. And even if you think, well, I brought this person on, they have to know that I support them. If they go to the courtroom and they experience something, you know, they're getting hostility from the judge or from law enforcement. Well, they don't actually know that unless you say it. And so as you start to engage more in diversity, equity, and inclusion, you have to make sure you're saying throughout the hiring process, you know, we want to be a more diverse office. Say it during the onboarding process. Make sure that you are continuing to engage on this, even after you've brought people on board who might not be your quote unquote typical candidate or a typical employee. You have to actually verbalize that and kind of be active in order to make sure that they're not feeling isolated and alone when they come on board. Any questions? Or Lisa, do you have any questions? James or Charles, do you have any questions?
I'm giving our guests a chance. I have one last question in relation to what you just said about inclusion. What's the best way to balance making someone who comes in, as you were describing, from an underrepresented group, who may be the only one, you know, may be feeling potentially isolated? How do you balance being attentive to them while also not calling them out, right? It's very difficult to be the first or one of the only ones who are sort of called upon to represent how things about, you know, that group works. So, you know, but at the same time, you also want to be attentive to what the needs are. So what's the balance there?
Yeah, so I would say start with honesty and have that conversation and say, we're excited that you're on board. We're happy that you're here. You may experience these things. If you experience hostility, if you, whether outside of the office or inside of the office, you should say something about that. You shouldn't hold that in and then let it build and build and build. And then, I think oftentimes by the time someone finally speaks about it, and speaking from personal experience, by the time someone finally speaks about it, they're already like, okay, I'm not working here anymore. Like, okay, it's already built up so much. And, I didn't know that I could talk about it, but, kind of, I'm not sure how it works in every provider office, but kind of to do like, how was court today? Did anything unusual happen? Encourage and, say you can speak about these things openly. Make sure that you're always leaving the door open, because I think that a lot of times it kind of goes unreported. And it's because I think the employee feels like if I say something, they're going to think like this affects my work, or, I'm not taking it seriously, where sometimes an employee just feels like they just want to talk about it. They just want to be able to say what happened and get it out and know that they had, someone who was supportive, that they were able to speak about something with, and then they're able to move forward. But you definitely have to kind of take on this role and take on that responsibility of saying that, I am going to check in because I know that this person is in a new situation. You don't have to do it every single day, but kind of making sure that you're kind of being more active in engaging with your staff. I think I see Charles turned his mic on.
Hello.
Hello.
I don't have much to add. I just really wanted to, just give you kudos on a great presentation, a great talk. I think it's all very much relevant, of course. And I think these conversations, it's funny because I just finished the training about this about an hour ago with some of our new attorneys, and we had a great discussion around why this is important. And I think that's really what it gets to, is building the value that your organization has made this a priority. And I think that's where some organizations, both in our field and outside of our field, lose sight of things where, like you said, DEI should be in the DNA, so to speak. It should be embedded in the mission of the company. And I think a lot of organizations would do well to, really put the resources and the commitment to this, because like you said, organizations will perform better when this is present, and people will be able to bring their whole selves to work, and they'll feel included. So I just want to give you, of course, we've had conversations, but I just want to give you your just due on that, because it's important, and we have to keep this conversation alive, because right now it's trendy to do DEI work, but are we in it for the long haul? And I think that's the question we all want to know. A year, 2 years, 5 years, are we still going to be doing this work, and will we have made progress? And I think you're doing the work that is very encouraging. So thank you.
Thank you. And for those of you that don't know, Charles is the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Director, Suffolk County Legal Aid Society.
Yes.
Yes. And has been a great help to me as I've been working on these issues. And this is the first time I'm actually seeing you in person.
Yes.
Virtually.
Yeah, same. So it's good. It's good. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think that's my part of the presentation. And if anyone has questions, of course, don't hesitate to email me. Don't hesitate to reach out. You can always reach out to your attorney that's working with you on your budget issues or anything else that you're working on, and we can connect as well. If you want to set up a one-on-one meeting to kind of talk about, if you want to create a DEI plan for your office, we can do that. Don't hesitate. I know that it's a little bit scary, but kind of the first step is just kind of making the phone call and saying, okay, this is where we are and where can we go?
So thank you. And I so appreciate you, Lucelle, that you spent your time with us today. Even though we have a small group with us, I know that your message will go out to everyone who watches the video. And certainly, I think it will make a huge impact on what happens during our career fair, certainly, and hopefully going forward as well. Thank you so much. And thank you, Charles, for piping in as well. We really appreciate your words. It is so important, and we're really, really happy we were able to include you in our training. So you're welcome to stay with us for the Zoom portion, seeing that you don't use Zoom very often if you want to learn something, but you're also welcome to go continue your day. So thank you so much, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.